Good morning. If you could take your seats, well, as I mentioned, we'll get started a little early, and we're going to open this morning with Mary Round with a few comments. Mary?
Good morning, right? Day two is always a little bit different than day one. All that energy's kind of gone. So thank those of you that came back for the second day. I call this the leak factor. In all conferences, we start to lose people. Yeah, on the second day. So thanks all of you for coming back. We have 4 good panels today. So I know a few of our guests are going to be leaving, and I want to make sure I have some comments, especially if you folks there in the front row go out. Admiral, thank you very much. Admiral Cassivi, thank you for coming down from Canada. I look forward to working with you at the War College. I sent out a memo last night to have you come, so we'll see what happens. General Meade, fantastic to have you here. Thank you very much for coming, and your aide, Alicia, and Bjorn, thank you for all your help. Admiral Soto's gone. Dr. Ramajo, are you in here? Yes, thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate having such good panelists in the program. It's the first year for that, and you were great. The rest of you, I really appreciate you coming too. In case some of you leave, I'm saying goodbye right now, and I'll say goodbye the second time at the end of the day. So those are my morning comments, and let's have a good day.
So I just wanted to set the stage a little bit. Yesterday was an amazing day. The theme of the conference is promoting global leadership. We had a lot of international perspectives that were shared, so I just want to remind everyone, Canada, Jamaica, Uruguay, Chile, Japan, and Tonga, and other international case studies, and you'll hear more international case studies today as we continue talking about these themes. We talked about women in leadership positions, everything from their traits to their challenges. We talked about increasing inclusion in the military, in education, and training, and how important that is. And we talked about women in foreign policy, civil society, terrorism, genocide, and broadly in conflict. Overall, we talked about the agency of women and the importance of women in national security decision-making. So that was just kind of an overview of all the different types of things we heard about yesterday. We're going to start today. We have 4 wonderful panels. We are going to shift the schedule a little bit, but the order of everything we're going to do is going to remain the same. So Colonel Michael Clark is going to start with our first panel, and I'd like to invite those panelists up, and the first panel is on cyber.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you, Andrea. And I wanted to thank Dr. Rahm, Dr. Moffett for this opportunity. This has been just an amazing experience for me to be able to participate in this as an Air Force guy amongst all the Navy folks, and it's nice to have even Army, and we had one other Air Force person here, so appreciate the camaraderie from the Air Force side. Yesterday to me was a very inspiring. And it was one of those days where all the presenters and panel members, it was one of those things that, there were moments that really made me laugh. There were some moments that really made me think deep and hard. And there were some moments that moved me to tears. And that in the famous words of Jimmy Valvano. Anybody know who Jimmy Valvano is? Yeah. So all right, if you're all familiar, he's a famous basketball coach, and he said if you can make you laugh, cry, and move you to tears, you've had one heck of a day. So I had one heck of a day yesterday.
Did you watch the game last night?
I did watch that game last night. That's what moved me to tears. I got to tell you, that was the tears part. So I'm a Cleveland fan. Sorry. So anyway, this group here, you all are as inspiring to the women, peace, and security movement as Jimmy Valvano is to basketball and cancer research. So I thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity to participate in this. We've got a very exciting panel this morning, cyber. And cyber means different things to different people. And I kind of wanted to start with a little bit because we had a little bit of a conversation yesterday about this. Hacker. When you think hacker, do you think positive? Raise a hand. Negative. Raise a hand. Well, so if for those that don't remember, it's a mix. Yes, sir. I agree with you 100%. So I used to think, hacker is one of those terms today we think of as bad, as somebody's hacking into my system. But if you want to go back to the roots of hacker, who knows MacGyver? Yeah, so MacGyver was actually the original hack. He was the one that was hacking things together, finding different ways of making things work, turning them operational. Another good example of that is Matt Damon in The Martian, right? He had to figure out, how do I pull things together? I got to survive. I got to make things work with what I've got. Not necessarily by design, not necessarily the way it was intended to be done, but I'm going to hack things together. So if you talk to hackers today, hackers will tell you we're about making things work, not necessarily about breaking things. Now, that said, there are good hackers and there are bad hackers. We call them the black hats and the white hats. And I think Rhea is going to get into that a little later on in a part of her presentation, but that's a big part of it. So I want to frame that concept of cyber. Cyber to a lot of people, cyber is kind of scary. Cyber is kind of an unknown, but cyber is one of those things that is going to become an enabler as we move forward, especially in our military operations and other activities. So the panel this morning, we've got with us Rhea Siers. I almost said it again. I told you I was going to do that.
That's all right.
And Rhea actually comes to us. She's the Executive Director for Cybersecurity and Information at the Risk Assistance and Network Exchange, RAIN. She is also a Senior Fellow for Policy and Legal Issues at the Institute for Information Infrastructure Protection, I3P. I thought we had all the best acronyms in the Air Force, but Rhea has shown me that they've got their own.
That's a good one.
She's also served time with the National Security Agency, so a lot of experience there. And then our other panel member is Dr. Elena Masters. She's an academic administrator and has served as an associate professor in the National Security Decision-Making Department of the Naval War College and held various senior intelligence and policy positions in the Office of Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Defense Intelligence Agency. She is also an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins University. So really looking forward to some exciting information from the two of you. So take it away, Rhea.
Okay. Well, good morning. For those of you who are familiar with NSA, National Security Agency, where I served for a little over 30 years, I want you to notice that I'm making eye contact with all of you. One of the issues, Colonel mentioned all these shows and movies that have to do with cyber. People often ask me what it was like to work at NSA for 30 years, and for those of you who are familiar with the Big Bang Theory, it's an agency full of Sheldons, essentially. So I'm slightly different than that mold. And I also think that women have brought different personalities to the cyber table as well. So thank you, first of all, for inviting me here and for giving me an opportunity to discuss cybersecurity. Women have to have a seat at the cyber table. To have a continuing impact on national security today. I really think there's no debate about that statement at this point. And that's probably why I'm so passionate about it. First of all, I spent 30 years in it, but beyond that, I want to explain a little bit how and why this must happen. So the growing impact of cyber threats has led to changes in both the public and private sectors, from the creation of the U.S. Cyber Command, which of course you probably read about lately, to the burgeoning cybersecurity market, as well as, I'd say, a pretty stunning array of resources to protect critical infrastructure, from economic to energy to, unfortunately, our electoral process. So as Elena and I began to discuss gender issues, initially related to the cyber crime world, it became clear that the research was complicated by longstanding gender issues in the cybersecurity, STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics field writ large. So today, what we decided to do was to divide our presentation into a macro and micro view, so to speak. I'll begin by taking the macro view of cyber threats and national security and why we continue to struggle not only with gender issues, but with a highly technical focus that often excludes a multidisciplinary approach that is really badly needed in the cyber threat arena. The current cyber domain approach, especially in academia, by the way, tends to be heavy on technical methodology, but often lacks the context behind the attribution of cyber activity. So about 11% of information security professionals of all types in the US are women, although women are more than likely than their male colleagues to hold a master's degree or higher in the field. The figures are different in different regions and countries. They tend to be lower than the United States. The only exception is Israel, where 25% of information security professionals are women, and we can discuss why that's different during the question and answer. A deeper dive into the statistics show some positive movement in the last number of years, certainly an increase, but not a strong showing in leadership ranks, specifically Chief Information Security Officer or CISO positions. So while experiences always differ, a hostile work environment is frankly at least one factor in the number of women in these fields, as well as, by the way, a very high attrition rate. This is a problem, unfortunately, I've personally witnessed in what some of us lovingly call the techno-bro culture that permeates cybersecurity. But not all of this results from an active hostile environment, and I wouldn't want to give that impression, but I'm going to give you a very recent example of why I think there's a problem. One of the largest cybersecurity conferences every year is called the RSA Conference. RSA is a cybersecurity company. And just a little over a month ago, there was an RSA conference in San Francisco. There were literally, really almost 100,000 participants. And thousands of women, not hundreds of women, but thousands of women. However, when the program came out for the conference, interestingly enough, not one keynote speaker on the 5 days of the conference and different sessions was a woman. There was one woman keynoter, and it was Monica Lewinsky, who was going to discuss cyberbullying, which is a very important platform, but frankly hardly related to the business of cybersecurity. For the first time, I think I saw, and maybe this is also a response to some of the Me Too movement, women really get angry about it. And so they decided to hold their own one-day conference, conveniently located also in San Francisco, not necessarily competitively, but to showcase women who had, by the way, remarkably similar skills to a lot of the men who were speaking. This is a pattern I'll talk about historically where women are somewhat anonymous in the field, and it's a pattern that we really need to see end. You've all heard the laments probably about this huge cybersecurity job gap. There's various estimates, upwards to 3.5 million jobs unfilled related to cybersecurity up to the year 2020. I think some of these estimates are exaggerated, frankly, but the gap does point to another very important national security issue, the inability to harness resources to protect our public and private sectors. That inability actually begins in school and carries through in cybersecurity organizations. Although I will note that this is not necessarily as endemic in the intelligence community like NSA or the military or at some exceptional academic programs like the one at Carnegie Mellon. We can discuss that at the questions and answers as well. It's important to note that the black hats that Elena will discuss, the cyber criminals, are actually the leading reason for this huge increase in cybersecurity-related jobs. Cyber crimes, that is attacks primarily against the private sector, actually, will more than triple the job openings in the next 5 years. So all the more reason that we should be encouraging more girls and boys in STEM endeavors as early as possible in school. And that's why, frankly, you're starting to see really important programs like learning how to code, like a cybersecurity badge, in the merit badge in the Girl Scouts. In Estonia, where all students begin to learn coding in the 2nd grade. This is how we develop a cyber tech acumen, regardless of future majors or gender. On the tech side, women will increase their leadership and presence if they embrace cutting-edge technologies like artificial intelligence and growing issues like the Internet of Things, that is your refrigerator that's taking over your house, allegedly, and things like blockchain, which you hear banks talk about a lot. But we also have to acknowledge a need for multidisciplinary approaches to cybersecurity. We give a lot of lip service to that multidisciplinary word, including in academia, but the most successful cyber education programs, like the military preparation programs in Israel, have increased their emphasis not just on STEM, but on policy planning, strategy, and impacts related to cyber. There's another challenge as well in the development of the cyber workforce, understanding that a range of non-technical knowledge is also essential to our future success. Why? Because we need innovation. Cyber is completely focused on innovation, and we need it coupled with an understanding of policy, economics, business, behavior, and organizations. In other words, we need to attract those who are not interested in a pure technical degree to help form the foundation of cyber practice. We need people who can provide context to the technical data, and we must develop cyber literacy throughout our entire workforce. In his wonderful book, The Innovators, Walter Isaacson writes about the pioneers of the digital age who were able to think differently because they were not exclusively locked into one discipline. We have the same need today. We need the same passion for cross-disciplinary knowledge and skills. So let me give you an example of why our training cyber analysts, technical and non-technical, is so critical. It's because we have to be really careful not to create a technical echo chamber for this national security issue. We need to make an understanding of the cyber domain an inclusive field instead of an exclusive field as it functions now. And I'll give you an example. A few years ago, we witnessed an act of what President Obama at the time called cyber vandalism. It was actually cyber destruction, directed against the networks of the Sony Pictures Entertainment. The destruction was quite serious and somewhat unprecedented against a private U.S. company. Frozen computers, leaked proprietary and personal information, and it was, of course, accompanied by threats against movie theaters for showing. I forced myself to watch the movie. The North Koreans were so upset about it. It was really not worth the effort on their part. And after that attack came an argument about attribution, which is the Cyber Whodunit question. It lasted several weeks within and outside the cyber security community, and theories and counterclaims shot across cyber publications and blogs. It was actually quite passionate and crazy. Shortly after the attack, the FBI fingered the North Koreans, who had previously engaged in a much more limited pattern of cyber activity. By the way, not anymore. Arguments raged over the technical data, over whether the FBI knew what it was talking about, over claims that the North Koreans didn't have a clear motive for the attack, kind of as if getting into the head of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un was an easy matter and tech data would magically reveal the answer. Attribution is critical for cyber defense and deterrence. Our policy and rules of engagement demand accountability and therefore must be premised on the perpetrator's identity. Likewise, common sense demands clarity and evidence. Our network defenders in both the private and public sectors need to know who they are facing and what these adversaries seek in our networks. It's not all about technical and tactical data. Sure, it's really great. It's great fun, if you're into it, to be able to track the perpetrators through previous signatures and malware, and that's a big part of the puzzle, but it's not the entire picture. Intelligence information and a strategic understanding of the attacker's objectives matter too. In fact, we are now entering a period where there is a good deal of, for lack of a better word, fuzziness in terms of who is controlling certain cyber activities. This is especially true, by the way, in Russian, Chinese, North Korean, and Iranian activities. I reel those right off because they're the usual suspects. Is it state-controlled? Are they so-called patriotic hackers, which the Russians sometimes call their hackers? Are they intelligence operatives, some of them moonlighting for transnational criminal organization? In other words, it's a muddied picture. So understanding potential impacts by our own offensive cyber activity as well and our adversaries is critical. We need to understand the secondary effects of taking out a server or an electric grid. We need to understand the serious potential for collateral damage and those impacts on our strategies and objectives. Remember that there can be unintended consequences in what we call a cyber kill switch, shutting off, essentially, the ability, for example, to shoot off anti-aircraft missiles, among other things. You might take down a communications center, but you also might take down a hospital. And so this view that sometimes I think pervades certain strains of thought on cyber, that somehow it's cleaner than kinetic power, is not necessarily true. And we need people to speak truth to that power on occasion. Understanding and evaluating threat and risk should be part of a holistic approach. We're still talking here about good old-fashioned actionable intelligence analysis here, albeit with some more complex technical data. If we want to design effective cyber defenses and deterrent, it's not just about the information, it's about the intelligence, the tactics, the techniques, the procedures employed by the adversary. It's about context. Context can help us find the right standard for attribution, a standard which should emphasize the critical thinking and analysis, not just speed or public relations. And by the way, in the end, despite all the doubt, we know intelligence analysis matters because in the Sony attack, the government eventually admitted, under pressure, that intelligence and existing operations against North Korea formed the core of U.S. officials' conclusion that Pyongyang was responsible for the activity. In other words, integrated intelligence helped solve the problem, and it reminded us that cyber does not necessarily stand alone. That, in fact, for those of you familiar with the history of cryptology, signals intelligence, and electronic warfare, you know this has been a part of integrated operations for a very long time. And speaking of history, you should also know, if you know history, that women were among the pioneers in cryptology. Elizabeth Smith Friedman, Grace Hopper, and then some anonymous women, the female codebreakers in this country, book just written about them. If you saw the movie The Imitation Game, the female codebreakers at Bletchley Park during World War II. Women are not a novel presence in cyber. They should not be anonymous, and they are not a novelty. Unfortunately, sometimes that's precisely how they're treated. So I teach several courses at 2 global security programs at George Washington University and Johns Hopkins University, and 1 business school program focusing on cyber strategy, threats, policy, simulations to scare people, that type of thing. And more of my students are taking their analytic skills to banks, businesses, and government. And they're defending against a broad array of cyber adversaries. We need every one of them. Elena is going to discuss women among the black hats, in other words, the bad ones, the bad seeds, and the white hats of our hackers. It's actually on the white hat side that I think we can make the most progress, thankfully, on recruiting and educating women and other underrepresented groups in the cyber realm. And so to me, this is not just an opportunity issue, it's a national security issue. We cannot deal with this burgeoning threat without including all groups into useful roles in cyber. And we are already, quite frankly, late in doing so. We need to change the dynamic across the public, private, and academic sectors, and we need to do it as soon as possible. Thank you.
Elena.
All right. Well, thanks to Susan and Mary for having me, and Michael for keeping Rhea in line over there as I talk about the black hats. Let me just preface this by saying that I've always been interested as an academic and as a professional in perpetrators of violence and criminal activity. And I don't know what that says about me, but I really find it interesting to know their motivations, and it just helps, like Rhea said, contextually, especially in the intelligence community. This has been already mentioned, but perpetrators, women perpetrators, are really absent from the discussion, and it was great to see 2 panels yesterday. I mean, 2 people discussing women perpetrators, because I really think that's a gap in the women, peace, and security agenda. So hackers in general, so they're no longer the young males in the basement wearing a hoodie. I think we know that by now. But the studies are very sporadic on hackers, and they're not specific to women. And they can include white and black hats. It's never very clear about who they're talking about. They say hacker, and I'm not sure if it's, you know, a white hat or a black hat or a gray hat, because there's some in between, apparently. So not all hackers have criminal intent. So some studies have proposed general typologies of hackers, and these include motivation. And this is delineated by level of skill. So for example, a Canadian psychologist, Mark Rogers, said of hackers, generally that they tend to minimize or misconstrue the consequences, and they say they're performing a service. And there's some typologies he suggested, and I'm not sure how accurate these are, but he calls some old school hackers, okay, so they don't have malicious intent, but they may lack a concern for privacy or proprietary information. So they believe that the internet is made to be open. Script kiddies or cyberpunks between the ages of 12 and 30, so that's a big age range, predominantly white and male. Average grade is 12 for education. They're bored in school, but very adept at computers and technology, and their intent is to vandalize or disrupt. Professionals, they call them criminals or crackers. There's a debate whether or not you call a hacker a cracker or a hacker, but the crackers are meant, you know, with malintent. So they make a living breaking into systems and selling the information, and they might get hired for corporate or government espionage. And finally, coders and virus writers, they have a programming background, and they write code. They don't use it themselves. They let others introduce it to the community. So even with these categories, it's really hard to know what motivates a hacker, a man or a woman. So other studies do look at motivation, but gender wasn't mentioned specifically or called out. Okay, so sometimes they mentioned women in the data, but it was very unclear the difference between men and women. So let me take you through a couple of these studies, just what we do know. And again, they don't necessarily agree with each other. So one of these studies noted that hackers are of high intelligence, consuming curiosity, and they're good with intellectual abstractions. Most are individualistic and anti-conformist. And another study gave questionnaires and actually interviewed hackers, and these, I assume, were black hats. And they aren't markedly different from anyone else aside from being criminals. That's what the study found. The highest rated motivations are intellectual challenge, to learn about computing and computers, and the lowest rated are to break the law or to be known. Another survey taken at Black Hat USA Hacker Conference, 51% stated they were mostly motivated by fun or thrill seeking. 30% chose the option of social consciousness or moral compass. 18% chose the option of financial gain. All right, and less than 5% of the hackers were motivated by notoriety. Now again, these are descriptions, right? So automatically I'm suspect of anything they say in an interview. But and still another study examined the motivations of 28 software hackers, and they administered an online survey. Personal challenge was one of the highest rated motivations. Peer recognition as well as tangible rewards like money were not considered important drivers. In a similar vein, they were motivated by public demand nor by personal need. But open-ended questions revealed that they recognized they were admired by others. So, and finally, another study used data collected with a questionnaire, and this was actually done by the German Federal Bureau of Criminal Investigation. And they looked at 599 people, so this is a bigger study. And these people had already engaged in identity theft. And the two most frequently chosen drivers were economic reasons at 51% and trial and error at 33.1%. Amongst the less cited motivations were fooling around, acceptance of the group, or competition. So in the last study of 54 hackers in descending order, they ranked were fun, thrill, excitement, curiosity, computer virtuosity, economic accounts, nosy curiosity and voyeurism, and revenge. So all the bad stuff at the end. So again, this study is interesting because it looks at motivation in particular, but as I said earlier, these are self-identified motivations. And sometimes it seems that the categories were picked for them, so we're not really sure about what the real intent was. So as Rhea talked about, we know that there's less women than men in the cyber community in general. So this also varies depending on country. Women are actually underrepresented in hacker challenges. For example, Hacker Rank had an event and their participants were 17.1% female, 82.9% male. So when they have these challenges to try and hack, we see predominantly males. And the top countries were India, UAE, Romania, China, and Sri Lanka in the competition. Gender disparity is much more pronounced in the black hat world, I believe. But anonymity is the key to this world. So we're not really sure whether a hacker is a woman or a man. And what we do know is that the criminal world is dominated by men, and the preponderance of arrests are males. For example, the Bureau of Justice Statistics noted in their 2016 data, 93% of prisoners in state and federal prison are men. So that's about 1 million. So according to those who study this community, hacking is a male activity. Others have stated that it is a boy culture and that males are just more attracted to it. And several media accounts talking about women in hacking, they give a lot of theories about why women would, about women in the hacking community. So I'm going to just warn you in advance that some of this is just very stereotypical. But it's said by women as well, so take it for what it is. So Jane Favero, who's a network security manager at New York University, she's caught a bunch of students for breaking into their machines, and not one of them has been female, according to her. And I quote, "I'm not sure if there's much about hacking that attracts the average teenage girl. My impression is that they're not interested in the pointless glory of defacing a website." Bruce Sterling, who writes about hacking, said, "It's true, there are no women hackers, but it is no longer amazes me. Hacking is a teenage mare, voyeur, thrill, power trip activity. You don't find female computer intruders any more than you find female voyeurs who are obsessed with catching glimpses of men's underwear. Women are very, very rarely arrested for sneaking around in the dark at night, peering through bedroom windows. Teenage males are arrested for this all the time." I have a teenage son, so that's a little frightening. It's not that women are physically or mentally unable to do it, it's just that there's no motive. You don't believe me? I would advise you to go to some hacking sites and get the omnipresent point-and-click software, and go ahead and crack into some computers. You will soon discover how incredibly dull it is. There is no emotional payoff there. You don't find young men who shoplift cosmetics. They just never do it. But young women do that all the time, stealing expensive lipstick and hiding it in your purse. That is the female emotional equivalent of a hacking crime. So there aren't many women who cruise around sites trying to snitch passwords and break into stuff at random. I don't know of any such woman personally, and I've never heard of a woman who would do it on her own without some boyfriend at her shoulder telling her how exciting it is. Okay, so that's the hacking community perception of a hacker. Gail Thackeray, who prosecutes hackers in Arizona, explained about the lack of women hackers. No, there are no serious technical women hackers. It's still largely a white male thing, at least here in the US. Many women seem to obsess about different things. By and large, even though many little girls play baseball, you never meet one who obsessively memorizes the professional baseball stats the way whole armies of boys do. So I don't think it comes as any surprise that the hacker community has been described as misogynistic. It's an unfriendly club to women. Women face harassment at hacker conferences. At a DEF CON event, has been called out specifically as being very problematic for women. Issues including bullying, belittling, and harassment of women occur at these conferences. And so this was very interesting. They, I don't know how many of you understand or play soccer, have kids who play soccer, but they, they hand out red or yellow cards. And so they devised these 3 cards, green, yellow, and red cards, and they were handing them out. They were called creeper cards, handing them out to men when they did something misogynistic to inform them, and there was a description basically telling them that you're a creeper, and here's why. But they did thank them if they didn't do a creeper thing, and they were nice to them. So one place where we find large numbers of women is in the hacktivist community. Hacktivism is a combination of activism and hacking. I would argue this is still black hat, unless you're working for the government and you're considered one of the good guys. And some examples of hacktivism include a hack known as the Panama Papers. I'm sure you all heard of this, and the Paradise Papers, who expose, the rich and powerful and all their money, hiding their assets. There was also the ISIS hack by the group Anonymous. GhostSec was also formed to hack ISIS, and an article on them in the news featured a female hacker. They actually interviewed a female in this. So in 1999, the Electronic Civil Disobedience Project hacked the Pentagon in a protest of the U.S. support of the suppression of the southern Mexican rebels. The group claimed that their hack was conceptual art. So there's a woman who calls herself Natasha Grigori. I don't know if many of you remember the Bullwinkle cartoon, but that was Bullwinkle's nemesis. She founded antiporn.org, a group of hackers who use their skills to track kiddie porn distributors, and they actually pass this information on to law enforcement. There was also an interesting study of individuals who engage in hacktivism, and they interviewed men and women in the US, UK, and Israel. So this was good because it was a cross-cultural study. And the study talked about the male oblivious discourse. And so one of their points was male hacktivists make gender a non-issue, therefore it doesn't exist. Women are not perceived, not represented as equals, and they don't get paid attention to. So in their interviews, and even though they were given the opportunity, they make no reference to their female colleagues, and they did not talk about the aspects of the male-only stereotype, or inequality or sexism. So this became evident in sections of the interview where they were offered the opportunity to talk about gender. They also used he and the guys in spoken masculine terms about hackers. So I'm going to read you a quote from one of them. And this is direct, so it's not that I'm illiterate, but he apparently is. And that's why we are anonymous the group. Basically, we are lie alone. We are like a small kid who's really muscled and full of muscles. And he doesn't even know it yet. It's like he's hitting the wall. And now then, wow, I did that. And that's why I think anonymous as one kid who got all this power but doesn't even know it yet. So on the other hand, though, they did interview women who had a markedly different view of this. And they say they are hacktivists fighting actually against male dominance. They feel separated from the community and their male colleagues, and they struggle with calling themselves hacktivists in that identity because of this. Women emphasize other women hacktivists. They talked about men in power and sexism. Women called males more destructive or defensive in their behavior. And they feel as though there are more women in the hacktivist community. It's not a fair and equal status. There is misogyny, and they struggle with gaining a reputation in the hacking community. So last year I talked about the portrayal of women terrorists in the media, and the same language is actually used to describe women hackers, which doesn't surprise me. So when they do a story on a women hacker, they talk about looks, personal background, relationships with men, sexuality, and style of dress. And this was, again, true in the terrorism community as well. There are sites like the 10 most sexiest female hackers that make you so hot. And this account I'm going to read you is on the hottest hacker chicks in internet history. And I quote, Adriana Cook is one former Playboy model you don't want to mess with. That's right, a former Playmate is on this list. Booyah! Sure, she's taken some naked pictures, but the woman has her dignity intact. A former friend of hers decided to post on the internet as her and also decided to take money for doing so. This did not sit well with her. If anyone was going to be making money off her slamming body, it was going to be her. When she came across the unauthorized website with her face and body on it, she took matters into her own hands and hacked into the account herself to take them down. Badass. When she came across an unauthorized website, after finding success in her attempts, Cook also used her hacking gift to help out others in similar situations, becoming known as the Hacker Fairy to other troubled women being taken advantage of on the internet. See a video of Cook in action below. She really sets the example for female hackers because she, like a lot of them, are something called hacktivists, kind of like the movie The Girl with a Dragon Tattoo. They're out there, almost cyber vigilantes, fighting against internet evil at every turn. Worst part about cyber vigilantes in this case is that we don't get the whole spandex treatment. It's not just portrayals of them, but self-portrayals as well. If you go through and look at the women hackers profile, they often give like very sexualized pictures of themselves posing. But you know, there is female empowerment. I don't want to say that all is bad in the world of criminal activity and black hats. The China Girl Security Team is a Chinese hacker group of women, and their goal is to actually break dominance in the world of hacking. And as Rhea mentioned, there's always alternative conferences for women now. Black Hat has an alternative conference as well. And there's been companies founded by women who hack and do criminal activities. So we see some examples of that in the media as well. But again, there's no good numbers. We have no idea what the percentage of women hackers are. So I believe in conclusion that there's really a dearth of really good studies, and this would be a really good area to study in the future. Thank you.
We'll now open it up for questions. Yeah, Chloe.
My question's for Ms. Siers, or Dr. Siers, and so in the past, there's been treaties for nuclear weapons, and now we're looking at cyber technology as it's being weaponized. Do you imagine there being like a START treaty equivalent for cyber technology between governments?
Well, they're the nascent seeds of it.
Okay.
And it's really interesting because women have been very prominent in the Talon Manual, and I think Dr. Schmidt, Mike Schmidt, is he at the Naval War College now? I can't remember. Yeah, okay. And he, of course, is the godfather, he would love that word, I think, of the Talon Manual. And so that's a group of legal experts who have come together to define at what point offensive cyber activity moves into the realm of an act of war. That's really part of the key inquiry there. There's a lot of discussion, and in fact, I just read something last night about discussions of having treaties that would restrict the ability, for example, of taking down an electric grid, which I referred to. There's a really big problem in the cyber world. It's not dissimilar to some of the things we've seen in terrorism, and that is you're always going to have outliers who do not abide. And I'm talking about state actors, not non-state actors. And so you have, for example, the Budapest Treaty, which is very much focused on cybercrime, trying to eliminate pornography, those types of things. Unfortunately, the outliers there are fairly, I would say, fulsome cyber powers like Russia and China. And so we have the seeds there. There's a group of experts at the UN that's actually worked it, but it's completely fallen apart recently. So I think the legal concepts are there down the road. I think one of the big problems is the cyber playing field. A lot of people like to compare it to nukes. It's really not like nukes at all in a lot of ways because the playing field in cyber is so much flatter. So non-state actors, although don't believe the hype about terrorists being big cyber actors, they're not. But the fact that non-state actors and criminal groups and others can get access to tools very easily changes the way we relate to it. So the seeds are there. This is a situation where something catastrophic will have to happen, quite frankly, although I am not a believer in the cyber Pearl Harbor theory. That would have to change, but some work is there. And the talent manual, there's 2 volumes, and it's really big. I say that as a lawyer, it's really big. But there are a lot of great discussions there from different viewpoints. It's not just US or Western experts. Dr. Schmidt brought in, especially for the second one, some folks from Eastern Europe, certainly from the Middle East, from China. So if you even just look at the index, it'll give you an idea of where they're heading.
And Rhea, doesn't it also kind of tie to the attribution piece you talked about earlier? It's a level playing field, but it's also understanding. It's easy to know who launched a nuke. It's harder to understand who launched a cyber attack.
It is, and what we say about attribution sometimes is it's really, really hard, except when it's not. And so the cybersecurity, and I'm going to say this because now I'm part of it, the private cybersecurity industry actually does a lot of damage here because everything's so focused on marketing and, they rush out analyses before. I would say that we would never rush out at NSA or in the military before they're ready for prime time.
Right.
So you have to be careful, but I also, the big argument rages at what percentage of credibility or verification do you need? And that's, depending on what your response is going to be, that's a pretty tough call.
Right. Great. Thank you.
So I find it interesting when you're talking about the, just those articles that, Elena, you're reading actually, but specifically listening to the fact that, you have this mindset, you have this gap, obviously, this blind spot that women can't be perpetrators, right? That just scares me as maybe as an attorney as well, because that means that they're probably just smarter, getting away with some of this stuff, and we haven't caught them yet. So, are those conversations being had at all, any high levels to discuss maybe what we're just missing, because we do have these blind spots, or are we just starting it here?
Well, I think there's one thing that's changed recently that and there's no data. This is one of the things that Elena and I were like, oh, I have this great idea. And then she called me, she said, there's nothing here, right? But thanks, Rhea, for leading me down that path. There is a sea change in the criminal cyber world that has occurred over the last 2 years. And that is the fact that crime has actually become a service, which Elena kind of alluded to. So some of the people who are involved in that, they actually are licensing malware and other things, and I think women are more involved in that. I think that's where we'll start seeing it. But I will tell you that because of the generally misogynistic tone of the hacker world, and she did not exaggerate it one bit, I have to say. If you've been near any black hat event, prior to the last couple of years, it's just amazing, I think one of the problems is that women, they feel they're in a hostile environment. And by the way, that hostile environment is not, as I said, just limited to black hats. It's also, unfortunately, very much a problem in startup companies. And I've had fathers usually come up to me after I speak and they say, my daughter just graduated from Virginia Tech. She has a degree in computer science. It's great. She has a choice between a startup and, let's say, I would say a more established company. And I always say or government, and I always say go to the more established company. And I think that's where women just generally head at this point.
In my view is that there's always a lesson learned, especially in the U.S., right? It has to happen to us for us to acknowledge it, and that happened with women suicide bombers in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Oh, we can't search a woman. A woman wouldn't do that, and kaboom. So I think we have to adapt and see women as perpetrators because they're not all good.
Sorry.
Ladies, thank you for your excellent presentations. Question for you. What could we do to better develop career tracks that are going to get us senior level 3- and 4-star female cyber commanders 15 years from now?
I think that what we need to do is be more multidisciplinary, but I also think that, the technology behind cyber has to be more imbued into the general curriculum. And in the militaries, when I just thought of this the other day, the Navy, for example, didn't have their first female cryptologic officer until the 80s, I believe. And so I think if you look at the Naval Academy, and actually my former boss at NSA is running that program. He's absolutely fantastic, Chris Inglis. He's looking at this multidisciplinary thing. So it's not just about engineering. You don't have to be in an engineering program to become a cyber analyst or to lead cyber operations. And that, by the way, is, believe it or not, the lesson I took from NSA. I started at NSA, before we called it cyber. We used to call it SIGINT. I started as a Middle East analyst. I mean, I didn't know what all this stuff was. I just knew Hezbollah. And, I like to look at my trajectory and those of my colleagues there in the same way, that we learned it as we needed it, but now you're too far behind the curve now. So we have to imbue it from the beginning, but we also have to teach the people on the technical side that, I mentioned this, that context is important. Analytically, we are falling behind, frankly, I don't think at NSA, but at other places, because we vest everything in a technical, we want to push the button and get the answer. Mm-hmm. And even cyber's not like that. So we just have to change thinking. And we have to make people comfortable with leading groups of people who may be more technically adept than. I mean, people worked for me who were amazing. I mean, Sheldon crazy levels, You got to let them be creative, and then you got to pull them back in before they break the law. And that's what we have to do.
So the other thing that, we've been finding within the DoD is the retention side of that. To get
Yeah.
those 3 and 4 stars, you have to energize and find those folks and give them purpose to retain. And so I was kind of curious if you had any thoughts on that retention problem, because we lose the DoD side to industry all the time.
Yeah, and that's a common problem. By the way, NSA has a very low attrition rate, amazingly. If you walk the halls, it will amaze you that they have a low attrition rate. And it's because of the sense of mission. But it's a sense of mission, frankly, although now we deploy more than any before, but it's without, frankly, the downside
Right.
of deployment to the theater. And I think we have to be honest about that. And the money in the private sector. But I'll tell you, I lived through the first bubble where we had trouble recruiting people, the first Silicon Valley bubble. And when that burst, it was a real lesson to people about why they preferred not working there. But I also think you can give people a sense of mission. But I think the real problem here is really organizational for all of us. I have a couple millennials of my own, and they don't like to stay in this, and I don't want to be stereotypical, but let's be honest. They like to stay in the same place all the time. We're not allowing people to move back and forth from the private to the public sector. And it's very difficult because of things like clearances and other things to do that. And, although there's been conversation, there's been studies about this, we need to be able to do that. And the Cyber Command, I know, has been looking into all these different incentives to bring people on board. And we just had, when people, as a lawyer, when people say we need to be more creative, I always get a little nervous. Creative, like, do we have to have the Constitution? But we have to learn how to be more creative within our civil service system and our military system to do that. So.
Great. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Great panel, and I often say it's not only gender, but it's generational that we're seeing, some issues. And I wrote a paper last year talking about, the new enemies of 15-year-old girl on Snapchat, that we don't understand that narrative, how to speak to her or how she is speaking to us. So how do we get around that when we have, 60-year-old men writing national security strategy that don't even understand what Snapchat or WhatsApp are?
You saw that congressional hearing?
So,
I've had to adapt to that as well, because I have a ton of millennials working for me. That's just how the workforce happened in education. But and I've actually had to read up on millennials and how to relate to them and talk to them, because it's just such a sea change for us. And like Rhea said, you know, they want different things.
They're not lifers either.
Yeah.
They're not going to spend 31 years at NSA.
Yeah.
They're not that stupid. So you have to relate to them that
Yeah.
way. But I also think that they need to see role models. You know, and it's not just gender-based, but there is a bit of that there. And I have to tell you, I never thought I would think grass is always greener on the other side. In the private sector in cybersecurity, there are definitely some fantastic role models, but they can't even be a keynote speaker somewhere. When I left NSA, 50% of the senior executives, of which I was one, were women. You know, so I think you have to encourage them to go places where they're going to find that kind of leadership, and it's never going to be perfect. But that's what you have to encourage. And it just so happens that I think that's some of the best mission we can encourage these young women to do, so.
Well, and it's also critical in the national security.
Yeah.
Because this is going to be it. You know, our adversaries are going to take advantage of this and see it as a gap. So how do we counter that?
Although they have gaps too. And, you know, you can't just use volume to make up for lack of skill. And I'm addressing the Chinese when I say that. You can use a lot of volume, but you're not always necessarily going to be at the top of your game. If you, the Mandiant study that was probably taken public too early about a specific unit details the gang that couldn't shoot straight. And that shows you that it's not just sheer numbers, it's also quality and background as well. I do see, though, and I think this is important, because I sit on a journal that has a conference and stuff. Well, this is something I do personally that I think is important. I will no longer participate in panels called Women in Cybersecurity unless they have a mentoring part to them, unless I'm sitting there with young women, you know, who want to hear what a fun time I had, right? I won't do that because it's a way to segregate women in cybersecurity, and we have to stop it. And I generally will not moderate panels, no offense, unless again, it's, you know, from the company I'm working for or something, because we have to stop putting women on the sidelines. There are enough women who know stuff, know a lot more than I do, that they should be in the center. And as women, we have to be advocates for that.
One last question.
Thank you. Rhea, my question is for you. You mentioned that there are about 5% women in the Israeli cybersecurity domain. Interestingly, women also make up 1/3 of Israeli defense forces.
Mhm.
So I would like to know what Israel is doing that's different.
Well, a couple things. First of all, in their preparatory programs that I mentioned, they have a multidisciplinary approach. They just actually completed a contract for 3 or 4 universities in Israel to help do those. In Israel, it's very prestigious to be in Unit 8200, which is kind of the equivalent of NSA and Cybercom all mixed together. It's just as prestigious as being a pilot. Startup Nation is something they take very seriously there, so it's lucrative. And they do focus. On the one hand, they look for people who are proficient in computer science and other things in high school, but also on the other hand, they take people who have no technical background, just have critical analytic skills. Again, it's not a scalable phenomena for us because it's a much smaller country. I think we have to be honest about that. But they also have seen, because now time has passed, how lucrative it can be to be an alumnus of 8200. Those are the people making big bucks. But by the way, there's a high number of female CISOs in Chief Information Security Officers among Israeli companies. So I think it's the phenomena of the military there, as well as the fact that it's now the country's primary export. So I think all those things together are very powerful lessons. I don't think there's any more acumen for tech than there is any place else.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your time. Thank you.